Welcome to the Somber Historian. Tonight, we begin a long journey. A journey not of conquest, but of connection. Not of sudden battles, but of quiet endurance. We will walk in the footsteps of the endless caravan, along the arteries of the ancient world, the Silk Road. We will not hurry its tales. We will let them unfold, like the unspooling of a faded tapestry, its threads worn soft by time and travel. I promise you a story of dust and stars, of markets that hummed with 1,000 tongues, now silent, of oases that bloomed like emeralds in the waste, now returned to the sand. This is a history for rest, for contemplation, a narrative to be felt more than heard. So, I invite you now to simply let go, to allow the weight of the day to dissolve into the deep, patient silence of the past. Close your eyes and listen. Listen to the whispers that remain, on the wind that still blows across the Taklamakan, in the cool, dark silence of a cave temple in Dunhuang, in the very dust that once settled on the bales of silk and sacks of spice. If these journeys into the quiet past bring you peace, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps this caravan to continue its slow, steady march through the annals of history, bringing more stories of silence and dust to those who need them. Leave a comment, sharing a place from the ancient world you would wish to visit in a dream. And know that you are now part of a quiet community of listeners, gathered here in the dark, tracing the old roads together. For now, just listen. The caravan is stirring, not from a single place or a single time, but from a need that arose, like a slow, deep breath, across the vastness of the continent. Long before there was a road of silk, there was a world of separate silences, empires that did not know each other's names, civilizations that slept and dreamed, in their own isolated gardens, unaware that their deepest yearnings were but echoes of a desire growing in a distant, foreign heart. In the east, under the vast, ordered sky of the Middle Kingdom, the Han Dynasty stretched its limbs. It was an empire of precision, of scholars tracing characters on bamboo slips and administrators measuring fields, a world that looked inward, finding perfection within its own walls. But on its western frontiers, in the dry, wind-swept corridors of the Hexi corridor, a restlessness lingered on the air, a whisper carried from the barren lands beyond. It was a curiosity about the world past the formidable mountains, and a growing, pragmatic need for something that the nomadic Xiongnu tribes possessed in abundance, a creature that clattered and thundered in battle, giving them their swift, terrifying power. The strong, swift, and vital horse. They desired, more than anything, the heavenly horses of Fergana, creatures of such mythic strength and endurance. They were said to sweat blood and were capable of carrying armoured men across impossible, arid distances. It was not a desire born purely of conquest or ambition, but of a simple, profound necessity for survival and stability, a need to bridge the dangerous gap between what they were, a settled, agrarian people, and what the wide, unknown, and threatening world demanded they become to secure their borders. This yearning for celestial steeds was the first silent pull, the initial, almost imperceptible tension on a thread that would someday stretch for thousands of miles. And simultaneously, in the west, the sprawling, marble-hearted Roman Empire, in its own relentless expansion, had developed a taste, an insatiable appetite for a luxury that was both symbol and substance, a material that was strong as metal, yet light as air, that shimmered with the untold wealth of a distant, almost fictional land. They desired silk. To the Roman senators and patricians, it was a decadent wonder, a second skin that spoke of unparalleled refinement and power. To their economists and thinkers, it was a silent crisis, a relentless river of silver and gold coin flowing endlessly eastward, draining the imperial treasury for a secret they could not possess, a manufacturing mystery guarded more fiercely than any fortification. This, then, was the true seed. Not a king's decree, or a general's ambitious campaign, but these quiet, relentless, and complementary hungers. A hunger for strength and security in the East. A hunger for beauty, status, and luxury in the West. Two great worlds, entirely unaware of each other's true form, leaning slowly, inevitably, toward one another across the sprawling, empty map of Asia. The vast space between them was not merely an emptiness to be crossed. It was a potential, a sleeping geography of deserts, mountains, and steppes, waiting not for a conqueror to carve a path of destruction, but for a connector to trace a line of fragile, enduring commerce. The ground between these two yearning civilizations was a brutal, beautiful negation of life itself. The Taklamakan Desert, a vast, silent sea of shifting sand, where dunes rose and fell like breaths, burying all memory and all who strayed from the path. North of it, the Tian Shan Mountains scraped the sky, and to the south, the terrifying, sheer ramparts of the Kunlun and the Himalayas presented a near impassable wall. And between them, the Pamir Knot, the roof of the world, where the air was thin and sharp as a blade, and the cold was a constant, penetrating pain. This was the barrier, a gauntlet thrown down by nature itself. To cross it required something far beyond mere courage. It required a profound, almost spiritual patience, and a specific, hardened knowledge earned through generations of failure and loss. It required, in essence, an engine. A technology not of fire and metal, but of biology and tradition. And that engine was not built of stone or forged metal, but of flesh and thick hair and immense, quiet endurance. It was a creature of mythic adaptation, a living ship designed by evolution for this specific, merciless ocean of sand, the Bactrian Camel. Its two humps were not merely stores of fat, but reservoirs of hope, of days of travel, for the desperate travellers who depended entirely on its profound resilience. Its long, dense lashes were veils against the blinding, sand-laden storms. Its nostrils could close to slits against the swirling dust. It could travel for days, even weeks, drinking nothing, surviving on the thorniest, most desolate and bitter plants, miraculously converting the very harshness of the land into the steady, plodding currency of forward motion. The caravan masters, the unsung logisticians of this slow-motion odyssey, were the true architects of the route. They learned to read the stars not as gods, but as a fixed and reliable chart painted on the night's canvas, to find water where none seemed to exist, by observing the flight of a certain bird or the stubborn presence of a specific, deep-rooted plant. They packed not for speed, but for sheer survival. Their loads were practical and life-giving, dried fruits and hard, salty cheese. Sacks of grain, not just for the men, but for the cherished camels at the journey's end, to restore their strength. Light, sturdy tents of felt, to provide shelter from the sun's tyranny and the night's deep freeze. And the most precious, heaviest cargo of all. Water, carried in swollen, smelly leather bags, its weight worth more than any spice or gem, each sip a measured calculation against the remaining distance. This collective knowledge, this arsenal of practical magic, was what transformed the impossible into the merely difficult. It was what made the silent, deadly spaces between worlds, slowly, patiently, navigable. The path was now conceivable, a fragile thread of life and commerce stretched across the roof of the world, waiting for the first, cautious steps to be taken. The path was now conceivable, a fragile thread of life and commerce stretched across the roof of the world, waiting for the first, cautious steps to be taken. But a thread is nothing without a needle to guide it. And this vast, empty landscape demanded a specific kind of needle. It required a man not of war, but of immense patience and quiet observation, a man who could listen to the whispers of the land and remember them. His name was Zhang Qian, a court official of steady heart and unassuming demeanor. He was not sent to conquer, but to converse. His mission, dictated by the ambitious Emperor Wu, was to find and forge an alliance with the Yuezhi people, a tribe displaced by the very Xiongnu nomads who plagued the Han frontiers. It was a diplomatic gambit, a hope for a distant ally. And so, with a small company of loyal men, he passed beyond the Jade Gate, the last fortified outpost of the Han world, and stepped into the realm of myth and dust. His journey was not one of glorious charge, but of quiet capture. The Xiongnu found them, as they found all who trespassed in their seas of grass. But instead of execution, there came a long, slow captivity, a decade of imposed stillness under the vast, open sky of the steppe. For a lesser man, it would have been an end. For Zhang Qian, it was an education. He learned the rhythms of the nomadic life, their dialects, their customs, the secret paths of the land. He stored every detail away, a mental map being drawn in silence and submission. He took a wife, had children, his life becoming a placid lake. Yet beneath the surface, the deep current of his mission never ceased its flow. And when the moment of inattention came, he fled. Not with a dramatic battle, but with a quiet, determined exodus, his loyal original followers and his Xiongnu wife by his side. He did not turn back to the safety of China. His purpose still lay ahead. He pressed on, westwards, towards the distant lands he had only heard of in stories. He traversed the oases around the Taklamakan, each a lonely, verdant island in a sea of sand. He skirted the horrors of the Lop Nor, the haunted, shifting marshland. He climbed the terrifying passes of the Pamirs, where the air grew thin and the world seemed to fall away below. He finally found the Yuezhi, but they had settled in the fertile valley of the Oxus River in a land of plenty. They had no desire to return east, to rekindle an old war. His diplomatic mission, the official reason for his years of suffering, had failed, and it was in this failure that his true, world-altering success was born. For on his long return journey, which would see him captured once more, and another year of delay, he was not just a diplomat, he was a living vessel of geographic and cultural intelligence. When he finally stood again before Emperor Wu, a man weathered and aged by 13 years of absence, he did not bring a treaty, he brought stories. He described the sophisticated urban civilizations he had encountered, the Dayuan, with their heavenly horses, the Bactrians, with their bustling markets, the powerful Parthian Empire, with its elaborate customs and silver coins. He spoke of lands farther west still, like Shendu, and a place even more distant and powerful called Lijian, which some historians would later whisper was Rome. He described the goods they possessed, not just horses but wines, spices, glassware, and intricate textiles. Most importantly, he described the routes, the ways through the mountains, the locations of the life-giving oases, the temperament of the tribes that controlled them. He presented, in essence, a blueprint, a manual for connectivity. The emperor, a pragmatic visionary, listened. The failed alliance was forgotten. What mattered was the map now etched into the mind of the Han court. The thread was no longer just conceivable, it was charted. The first, monumental stitch in the tapestry of the Silk Road had been pulled not by an army, but by the quiet, relentless perseverance of a single man. And with that chart, the caravans began to stir in earnest. They were not grand processions at first, but cautious, small trains of merchants and guards, trusting the ghost of Zhang Qian's path. They moved through landscapes of profound and beautiful desolation. The Gobi Desert, a vast expanse of gravel and stone, where the horizon shimmered in a perpetual mirage and the sun was a merciless white eye. The wind here was a constant, dry force, scouring the land, polishing the stones until they shone like dark glass under the relentless sky. Then, the even more treacherous Taklamakan, the place of no return. Here, the world was made of soft, shifting sand. Dunes rose like golden mountains, their crests sculpted by the wind into sharp, ever-changing lines. The silence here was different from the Gobi. It was a deep, absorbing silence, swallowed by the sand. A traveller's footsteps would vanish behind them within minutes, as if the desert itself was erasing their passage. To get lost here was to be consumed, buried without a trace. The bones of those who failed were bleached white by the sun, then covered by the slow, patient drift of the dunes, becoming unmarked graves in a sand ocean. The caravans navigated by a celestial map. The North Star, constant and fixed, was their guide in the darkness. By day, they watched the sun, and the subtle, wind-blown patterns on the dunes. They moved at a patient, plodding pace, the rhythm set by the camels. There was no rushing this journey. It was a slow, deliberate dance, with a landscape that could grant passage, but demanded respect in return. The price of haste was a slow, thirsty death, marked only by a circling vulture in the vast, empty sky. Their sanctuaries were the oases, to emerge from the yellow, blinding haze of the desert and see the distant, dark green smudge of poplar trees was to see life itself. The sound of water, trickling through irrigation canals, was a music more beautiful than any court symphony. Here, at places like Kashgar and Khotan, the world returned. The scent of water on dry earth, the shade of a fruit tree, the sound of other human voices. These were not just stops for rest. They were nervous systems of the route, places where goods were traded, news was exchanged, and cultures began their slow, hesitant intermingling. At the end of each grueling day, as the desert cold descended with a sudden, sharp intensity, the caravan would make camp. The silence of the landscape would be broken, not by loud voices, but by the soft, domestic sounds of survival. The dull thud of a saddle being lifted from a camel's back. The crackle of a small, carefully managed fire, fueled by dried camel dung. The low, guttural groans of the camels as they knelt for the night. The travellers would huddle close to the flames, their faces etched with the weariness of the day's march, their hands cupped around bowls of simple stew. They would speak in low tones, if they spoke at all, their words carried away by the wind that never truly ceased. They would look up at the impossible brilliance of the desert stars, a stark reminder of their own smallness in this immense, ancient geography. They were but temporary guests in a land that tolerated their passage, a slow-moving stream of humanity, tracing a faint, persistent line through the silence of the world. They were but temporary guests in a land that tolerated their passage, a slow-moving stream of humanity, tracing a faint, persistent line through the silence of the world. And with every journey, that line grew a little deeper, a little more defined. It was no longer just a path of survival, but a channel through which the world's pulse began to beat, a slow, rhythmic flow of more than just goods, but of ideas, of art, of faith. The caravans now carried seeds of cultures in their packs, nestled between bolts of silk and sacks of spice. This fragile, growing network needed anchors, places of administration and security, to transform it from a daring adventure into a reliable institution. And so, the Han Empire, under the steady, ambitious gaze of Emperor Wu, began to build a skeleton of order along the route. The Great Wall itself was extended, like a long, stone arm reaching westward into the Gobi. Watchtowers were constructed on high ground, their silent, square forms standing sentinel over the emptiness, where signal fires could relay messages across vast distances in a chain of light and smoke. But the most profound anchors were the commanderies, the Siu Protectorate, established in the oasis towns. These were not colonies of conquest, but garrisons of guarantee. Han soldiers, stationed far from the green fields of their homeland, patrolled the routes. They kept the peace between rival tribes, ensured the caravans could pass without being harassed by local bandits, and provided a semblance of Han law in the vast, lawless space. Their presence was a quiet statement, a promise to the merchants that their perilous investment would be protected, that the long arm of the empire now reached into the deserts, making the space between east and west just a little less empty, a little less wild. And the world began to flow in both directions. It was never a simple river from Chang'an to Rome. It was a complex, slow-moving delta of exchange. From the east came the silks, of course, but also lacquerware, with its deep, resonant sheen, built up from countless layers of sap and patience. Bronze mirrors, polished to such a perfect finish that they could reflect not just a face, but the very soul of the craftsman who made them. And perhaps most importantly, the humble, yet revolutionary peach and apricot trees, their seeds carried in a merchant's pouch, to eventually take root in Persian gardens and later, the orchards of the Mediterranean. From the west came a different kind of wealth. Glassware from Alexandria, a material that captured and held light in a way that porcelain could not. A small, translucent miracle. Fragrant spices like pepper and cinnamon, which did not just flavour food, but preserved it, and perfumed the very halls of power. Gold and silver coins, stamped with the faces of forgotten kings, becoming a universal currency of trust. Walnuts and pistachios, pomegranates and grapes. Each a tiny revolution in diet, a new flavor on the tongue of the world. But the most significant cargo had no weight and took no space in a pack saddle. It was carried on the breath and in the mind. Buddhism, a faith born in the Himalayan foothills, found its path to China not by sea but on the dusty shoulders of the Silk Road. It was carried by patient, wandering monks, their robes the same color as the dust, their minds focused on a truth that transcended the harsh physical reality of the deserts they crossed. They walked the same paths as the merchants, but their journey was inward, even as they moved outward across the continent. These monks established the first cave temples, like those at the Mogao Caves near Dunhuang. Here, at the very gateway to the desert, they carved out sanctuaries from the rock face. In the cool, dark silence of these caves, far from the wind and sun, they created entire worlds of devotion. They painted vast, intricate murals on the walls, depicting the life of the Buddha and his previous incarnations. The styles were a fusion, the graceful lines of Indian art, meeting the bold colors and compositions of Central Asia and China. The Silk Road was becoming a conduit for the soul, and these caves were its libraries, its universities, its quiet cathedrals. The journey of a single idea, like a scripture, was a story in itself. A Buddhist sutra, copied onto palm leaves in a monastery in Gandhara, would be carried by a merchant or a pilgrim for thousands of miles. It would be translated from Sanskrit into Sogdian by a scholar in a Samarkand library. Then, another traveller would carry that Sogdian version eastward, where a Kuchian monk might learn it. Finally, it would arrive at Dunhuang, where a team of Chinese scribes would undertake the monumental task of translating it into their own tongue, their brushes tracing elegant characters that sought to capture the profound meaning of the original. The words themselves were a caravan, changing their garments at each stop, but carrying the same essential truth across the world. And all along the route, in the oasis towns, a new sound began to emerge beneath the wind and the camel bells, the sound of 1,000 tongues. The Sogdians, the master middlemen of the route, haggled in their sharp, energetic language. Parthian and Bactrian merchants debated prices. Chinese officials recorded transactions in their meticulous script. This Babel was not one of confusion, but of a slow, grinding, practical understanding. A pidgin of trade developed, a simple language of numbers, goods, and gestures. It was in these markets, under the shade of poplar trees, that the world was slowly being stitched together, not by treaties, but by the mutual desire for a fair price and a reliable partner. The landscape itself bore witness to this gradual taming. The graves that now appeared along the route were no longer just anonymous mounds of sand. They were marked with stones, sometimes inscribed in multiple scripts. They held the bodies of men and women who had died far from their birthplaces. A Sogdian merchant buried with a Chinese coin in his hand, a Chinese soldier resting forever under the Central Asian sky. These silent sentinels were the true pioneers, their final resting places marking the slow, human colonization of this immense, empty space. They were the price of connection, the somber foundation upon which the Golden Age would eventually be built. The road was no longer just a path. It was becoming a place. A long, narrow civilization of its own, defined by movement and exchange, thriving in the silent, spacious margins between the great empires of the world. The road was no longer just a path. It was becoming a place. A long, narrow civilization of its own, defined by movement and exchange, thriving in the silent, spacious margins between the great empires of the world. And in the 8th century, under the watchful eyes of the Tang Dynasty in the east and the Abbasid Caliphate in the west, this slender civilization experienced its zenith, not as a loud, triumphant fanfare, but as a deep, resonant, and steady hum of activity that filled the spaces between the dunes and the mountains. This was the Golden Age, a time when the caravan became a world unto itself, a rolling, rhythmic microcosm of the ancient world. Imagine it now, not as a history, but as a sensation, a memory to settle into, a rhythm to match your breath. You are part of the caravan now. The day does not begin with a shout, but with a slow, gentle stirring. The first light of dawn is a pale, grey wash on the eastern horizon, barely illuminating the dark shapes of the resting camels, their forms like sleeping hills. The air is cold, sharp in the lungs, and the silence is profound, broken only by the soft, rhythmic chewing of a camel and the distant, lonely call of a desert bird. Then, a sound, the low, gentle voice of the caravan master, not raised in alarm, but murmuring to his assistants. This is the signal. The camp begins to stir with a quiet, practiced efficiency. There is no rush, only the steady, deliberate movements of a routine performed 1,000 times. You hear the soft rustle of felt blankets being folded, the heavy, dull thud of a saddle being lifted, the quiet, metallic jingle of a bridle. The camels groan their deep, resonant protests as they are encouraged to rise, their great knees buckling and straightening in a familiar, ungainly dance. The loading begins. Each item has its designated place, secured with knots that have been tied and untied for generations. The heavy bales of silk, surprisingly compact, are hoisted onto the wooden frames. The sacks of spices, whose fragrant scent still manages to seep through the woven threads, are carefully balanced. The ceramic jars, stuffed with straw to prevent them from clinking, are nestled securely. There is a rhythm to this work, a silent music of hands and ropes and burdens. It is a ritual of preparation, a meditation on the day to come. The sky lightens from grey to a soft, muted gold, and as the sun finally breaks the horizon, its first rays catch the dust motes, stirred by the caravan's awakening, turning them into a cloud of floating gold. And then, the walking begins. The caravan falls into its daily rhythm, a pace set by the plodding, unwavering gait of the camels. The world becomes a symphony of simple, repetitive sounds. The soft, shuffling fall of countless feet on sand and gravel, the steady, melodic clinking of the bells suspended from the camels' necks, each with its own tone, creating a random, soothing harmony. The occasional snort or grumble from the animals, the whisper of the ever-present wind, which sometimes rises to a mournful song as it sweeps across the dunes. There are no loud voices. Conversations, if they happen at all, are low and intermittent. Words exchanged between men who have walked together for months, their communication often needing no sound at all. The landscape unfolds with a slow, majestic monotony. The endless rolling sea of the Taklamakan, where the only features are the shapes of the dunes, constantly remade by the wind. The light changes throughout the day, from the soft gold of morning to the blinding, white-hot glare of noon, to the long, deep blue shadows of the afternoon. The mind, deprived of constant stimulation, turns inward. There is a profound peace in this emptiness, a clarity that comes from the reduction of life to its most essential elements, walking, breathing, and enduring. The heat of the day becomes a blanket, a heavy weight that encourages a quiet, waking dreaminess. This is the sleep section of the road, a place where the boundary between dream and reality softens, where the rhythm of the march becomes the rhythm of your own heart. As the sun begins its descent, painting the western sky in shades of orange and violet, the caravan master looks for a place to rest. Not an oasis, but simply a spot sheltered from the wind, perhaps near a rocky outcrop. The routine of unloading is the reverse of the morning, performed with the same quiet efficiency. The fires are lit, small, controlled points of light in the vast, gathering darkness. The evening meal is a simple affair, a shared pot of grain porridge, perhaps flavoured with a few dried dates or a pinch of salt. The warmth of the food is a profound comfort against the chill that now descends with the night. And then, the stars. Out here, far from any human light, the sky is a breathtaking spectacle. The Milky Way is not a faint smudge, but a brilliant, swirling river of diamonds arching from one horizon to the other. The constellations are sharp and clear, each one a familiar guide to the travellers. Men look up in silence, their faces illuminated by the cold, celestial light. They see the same patterns that guided Zhang Qian and the caravan masters before him. In this moment, under the immense, starry dome, the caravan feels both incredibly small and profoundly connected to the cosmos. This is the true zenith. Not the wealth in the bales, but this moment of quiet awe, this shared human experience under the ancient sky. In the great caravanserais that dot the route at longer intervals, the nightlife is a little more vibrant, but still subdued. These are not inns of revelry, but fortresses of rest. Within their high, protective walls, the sounds of the world are concentrated. You can hear the different languages from the various camps, the melodic tones of Sogdian, the sharper notes of Persian, the familiar lilt of Chinese. The air is thick with the smells of cooking from a dozen different cultures, sizzling lamb, boiling rice, baking flatbread. But even here, the dominant mood is one of weary contentment. The laughter is soft, the conversations are murmured. After the long, silent day, the human voice itself is a gentle, comforting sound. Men tend to blistered feet, mend torn clothing, and oil leather straps. It is a time of repair, both for the goods and for the people. And as the last fires die down to embers, the Caravanserai, too, succumbs to a deep collective sleep, guarded by the watchful stars and the enduring walls of stone. This is the peak, the quiet, sustained height of the Silk Road's journey. A golden age built not on conquest, but on the steady, rhythmic beat of footsteps and the silent understanding between a traveller and the endless road. This is the peak, the quiet, sustained height of the Silk Road's journey. A golden age built not on conquest, but on the steady, rhythmic beat of footsteps and the silent understanding between a traveller and the endless road. But heights, by their very nature, are precarious. They offer a clear view, but also make one susceptible to the changing winds. And the winds were beginning to shift. The deep, resonant hum of the Golden Age would not be shattered by a single, catastrophic crash, but would instead be gradually drowned out by a new, rising tide of silence. The first cracks in the great edifice of connectivity were not loud ruptures, but quiet, distant sighs. The first sigh was a political one, a slow exhalation of imperial breath from the east. The magnificent Tang dynasty, which had provided the stability and protection that allowed the caravans to flourish, began to turn its gaze inward. The Great and Lushan rebellion in the 8th century was not just a military conflict, it was a deep, internal convulsion that drained the empire's treasury and its attention. The court in Chang'an, once fixated on the wonders of the West, now found itself consumed with internal survival. One by one, the garrisons of the Anxi Protectorate were recalled. The soldiers who had patrolled the oases, their presence a silent promise of Han law and order, began their long march home. The watchtowers along the Hexi corridor were left to the care of the wind and the sand. The effect on the route was not immediate violence, but a slow, creeping vulnerability. The assurance of safety, so carefully cultivated over centuries, began to evaporate. Local tribes, once kept in check by the distant emperor's authority, now saw an opportunity. The caravans, still heavy with silk and silver, became more tempting and their passage more perilous. The cost of protection rose. The merchants had to pay more for local guides and guards, cutting into their profits, making the entire, monumental endeavour less sustainable. It was a decay of confidence, a rusting of the invisible machinery that had made the long journey worthwhile. Simultaneously, from the west, came another shift, not of politics, but of pathway. For centuries, the land route across Asia was the only reliable channel. But human ingenuity is a relentless force, and it began to find another way. The art of shipbuilding advanced, and knowledge of the monsoon winds solidified. Arab and Persian dhow ships began to venture more boldly across the Indian Ocean, sailing from the Persian Gulf to the ports of India, and eventually all the way to the great southern Chinese port of Guangzhou. This maritime Silk Road was different. It could carry volumes of goods that 1,000 camels could not. A single ship could hold the cargo of an entire caravan and more. The journey was still dangerous, subject to the fury of storms and the threat of pirates, but it avoided the countless taxes and tariffs levied by every oasis, town, and local chieftain along the land route. It bypassed the high frozen passes of the Pamirs and the waterless death of the Taklamakan. The centre of economic gravity began a slow, inexorable drift southwards, from the deserts of Central Asia to the Indian Ocean. The land route was no longer the only option, and in its redundancy, it began to lose its vital necessity. Then came a shift of a more visceral, biological kind. It was not an army, but an unseen passenger. In the 14th century, the Black Death swept out of Central Asia and into Europe. It is widely believed that the fleas carrying the Yersinia pestis bacterium hitched a ride in the fur of marmots and then transferred to the packs and the people of the Silk Road. The very connectivity that had been the route's greatest achievement became its most devastating vector. The caravans, which had once carried Buddhism and glass-making techniques, now carried a silent, microscopic plague. The pandemic did not create the silence. It revealed it. As the disease ravaged the oasis towns, the caravanserais fell quiet. The markets where 1,000 tongues had haggled were now filled with a different kind of murmur, the weak cries of the sick. The roads, once traced by the endless lines of camels, saw fewer and fewer travellers. The great cities of the route, Merv, Samarkand, Kashgar, were decimated. The tragedy was that the road, this grand instrument of cultural exchange, had ultimately brought the means of its own paralysis. The networks were still there, but they now pulsed with a deadly, not a life-giving, current. And finally, the most definitive silence of all came from the steppes. It was not a silence of emptiness, but a silence of finality, announced by the thunder of a new, unstoppable force. The Mongol armies of Genghis Khan did not aim to destroy the Silk Road. In fact, they would later revitalize it under the Pax Mongolica. But their initial, terrifying advance in the 13th century was a shockwave that shattered the old order completely. They swept through the Khwarezmian Empire, laying waste to legendary cities like Bukhara and Samarkand. The stories that trickled down the route were not of battles, but of aftermaths. The caravans that arrived at these cities would find not bustling markets, but fields of ruins. The air, once thick with the smells of cooking and commerce, now carried the faint, sickly sweet smell of death and smoke. The intricate irrigation canals that fed the oases were broken, their life-giving waters soaking uselessly into the sand. The Mongols were a force of nature, an earthquake that redrew the map. The old kingdoms that had managed the route, for all their faults, were gone. In their place was a new, terrifying, and absolute power. The road now belonged to the horse lords, and its future was uncertain. The great shift was complete. The Golden Age was now a memory, a ghost that walked the ruined caravanserais, its whispers lost in the new, cold wind that blew from the steppe. The long, sombre decline had begun. The Golden Age was now a memory, a ghost that walked the ruined caravanserais, its whispers lost in the new, cold wind that blew from the steppe. The long, sombre decline had begun. It was not a sudden collapse, not a single event that could be marked on a calendar, but a slow, inexorable fading, like the light leaching from the sky at dusk. The road did not die, it simply grew quieter, its vibrant hum diminishing year by year, decade by decade, until only echoes remained in the empty spaces between the mountains. The Pax Mongolica that followed the initial terror was a brief, final flicker of the old light. For a time, under the vast, organized dominion of the Khans, the route was safe again. A Christian bishop from the west could travel from Genoa to Khanbalik, the Mongol capital, and feel a semblance of security. Marco Polo's legendary journey was a product of this moment, a last, comprehensive glimpse of the connected world before the curtains began to draw closed. But this unity was imposed, a peace held together by the sheer, terrifying will of a single nomadic empire. It was the last gasp of the continental system, a final, deep breath before the lungs of the land route began to fail. And then, the world truly shifted. The Ming Dynasty, which rose after the Mongols, looked at the west and saw not opportunity, but threat. They turned their back on the deserts. The great voyages of Zheng He in the 15th century were a monumental declaration of this new direction. His colossal treasure ships, carrying thousands of men, did not travel west along the dusty land routes, but south and west across the Indian Ocean. They sailed to the very ports that the Arab dhows had been supplying for centuries. This was not a compliment to the Silk Road, it was its replacement on an imperial scale. The message was clear. The future of China's engagement with the world would be by sea, not by land. The resources, the attention, the imperial mandate that had once propped up the oases and garrisons of the West were now redirected to the coast. The final, symbolic act of this inward turn was the gradual abandonment and neglect of the Great Wall. The western sections, those long, lonely fingers of stone that had reached into the Gobi, were left to the elements. Without soldiers to man them, they became mere stone ridges, their purpose forgotten. The wind and the sand, patient and relentless, began their reclamation project. Sand dunes piled up against the northern faces, slowly burying the lower courses of stone. Winter frosts cracked and splintered the ramparts. The watchtowers, once the eyes of the empire, stared out over an emptiness that was no longer being watched. They became homes for scorpions and nesting birds, their signal fires forever extinguished. One by one, the great oasis cities began to wither. Their lifeblood had been the caravan traffic, and as that traffic diminished to a trickle, their economies starved. The sophisticated irrigation systems that had turned the desert green required constant, communal maintenance. As populations declined and wealth vanished, that maintenance was neglected. Canals silted up, springs were lost to the drifting sand. The desert, which had been held at bay for centuries, began its slow, steady march back into the towns. Sand piled in the streets, first in small drifts in the lee of buildings, then in great, sweeping waves that swallowed entire neighborhoods. The city of Lulan, once a thriving kingdom on the shores of Lop Nor, was completely consumed, its wooden buildings and temples buried until they were nothing more than faint, rectangular shadows in the desert, visible only from the air. The Caravanserais, those fortresses of hospitality, stood empty. Their great wooden gates, once polished by the hands of countless merchants, now sagged on their hinges, their timbers bleached grey by the sun and worn thin by the sand-blasting wind. Inside the courtyards, where the sounds of camels and men had once created a symphony of life, there was now only the whisper of the wind moving through empty archways. The central well, once the heart of the complex, would slowly fill with sand, its life-giving water now inaccessible, its depth a memory. These places became waypoints for ghosts, not for living men. The knowledge itself began to fade. The complex mental maps held by the caravan masters, the secrets of which dunes to skirt, which dry riverbed to follow after the rare rain, the location of the last, brackish well before a long, waterless stretch. This hard-won wisdom was no longer passed from father to son, because the sons were no longer making the journey. The stars still held their positions, but there were fewer and fewer eyes left to read them for this purpose. The road itself began to forget its own path. Without the constant traffic of feet and hooves to mark it, the wind erased the tracks. Dunes shifted and settled over the old trails, making them ambiguous, then impassable. The road was being unwritten, its lines scrubbed from the desert floor by the same natural forces that had always threatened it. And yet, it never completely died. In local, truncated sections, trade continued. A small train of camels might still carry jade from Khotan to Dunhuang, or carpets from Kashgar to Turpan. But these were local whispers, not the continental conversation that had once taken place. The world had refragmented. Europe, after the age of Columbus and Da Gama, had sailed around the blockage and found new worlds, its gaze turning violently towards the Atlantic. China retreated into its own cultural and political self-sufficiency. The great middle of Asia, the crossroads of the world, was no longer a crossroads. It became a backwater, a place of isolated towns and forgotten kingdoms, its glory days receding into the realm of legend and fairy tale. The silence that returned to the Taklamakan was deeper than the one that had preceded the road, because it was a silence that remembered its own broken music. It was the silence of a stage after the players have long departed, when the only thing left is the echo of the applause that has faded away and the slow, patient settling of dust on the empty boards. The endless caravan had, finally, reached its end. The endless caravan had, finally, reached its end. The silence that returned to the Taklamakan was deeper than the one that had preceded the road, because it was a silence that remembered its own broken music. But an end is never truly an end. it is a transformation. The great, physical movement of goods and people ceased, but the energy of that movement did not vanish. It dissipated, like heat from a stone after the sun has set, radiating outward in forms far less tangible, but perhaps even more enduring. The caravan was gone, but its echo remained, woven into the very fabric of the world that followed, a whisper that would shape the centuries to come. The most visible echoes are the ruins, the tangible ghosts. They are not hard to find, for one who knows how to look. They are the mounds of earth that rise with unnatural symmetry from the flat desert plain, the telltale signs of a buried city. Archaeologists call them tells. To the local herder, they are simply part of the landscape, a place where the earth is littered with broken pottery and strange, glazed tiles. If you were to stand on one of these mounds at dusk, as the shadows lengthen, you might see the ghost of the city beneath your feet. The setting sun throws the contours of the buried streets into sharp relief, and for a fleeting moment, the outline of a forgotten neighborhood emerges from the earth, a cartographic memory revealed only by the angle of the fading light. In the cool, dark silence of the Mogao caves, the echo is a visual symphony. The thousands of Buddha images, the countless murals depicting caravan journeys, celestial beings, and daily life, are a frozen testament to the fervor that traveled this road. But the true echo here is not just in the art itself, but in its layers. A Tang Dynasty mural of a bodhisattva might be painted over a faded, more Central Asian-style image from centuries earlier. The caves are a palimpsest of faith, each generation adding its own voice to the chorus, leaving a record of how an idea transformed as it moved, adapting to new lands, new eyes, new hands holding the brush. The silence in these caves is a listening silence, one that seems to hold the faint, remembered scent of incense and the murmured prayers of pilgrims from 1,000 years ago. Then there are the echoes in the earth itself, small and personal. A farmer, tilling his field near the old town of Kucha, might turn over the soil and find a single, worn coin. It is not gold or silver, but a simple copper issue, its surface green with age. On one side, the faint, barely legible script of Chinese characters. On the other, the image of a horse, a symbol of the trade that once passed through here. It is a small, heavy thing, but it carries the weight of a hand that dropped it centuries ago. A merchant, perhaps in a hurry, a traveller paying for a meal. Its loss was a small tragedy then, its finding is a quiet miracle now. It is a concrete piece of a connection that now seems almost imaginary. But the most profound echoes are the ones you cannot hold in your hand. They are the echoes in language, in cuisine, in the very cells of our bodies. The words we speak carry the ghosts of the Silk Road. The English word sugar finds its origin in the Sanskrit sakara, which travelled through Persian shakar and Arabic sukka before entering European languages. Orange comes from the Sanskrit naranga, passing through Persian narang and Arabic naranj. Every time we speak, we are unknowingly tracing the old roots, our vocabulary a living map of that ancient exchange. In the food we eat, the echoes are just as strong. A plate of pasta in Italy, a noodle soup in China. Their shared ancestry is a debate, but their connection through the movement of culinary ideas across the continent is a testament to the road's subtle influence. The spices that transformed European cuisine, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, all tell a story of a journey that began in the tropics of Asia and ended in a medieval kitchen in Venice or London. The tea that became the national drink of Britain first travelled from the mountains of China to the courts of the Mongols and then westwards. These are not just flavours, they are preserved histories on the tongue. And perhaps the most sombre echo of all is a biological one. The same connectivity that spread Buddhism and glassmaking also spread disease. The Black Death was the most devastating example, but lesser epidemics of smallpox, measles, and other contagions repeatedly travelled the routes. The populations of Europe and Asia, through this brutal, repeated exposure, developed genetic immunities that populations in the Americas, isolated from this web, did not possess. When the Europeans finally reached the New World, they carried with them, unknowingly, the final, tragic echo of the Silk Road germs that would devastate entire civilizations. The legacy of the road is thus written not only in our art and our words, but in the very antibodies that course through our veins, a silent, cellular memory of a connected world. The world that emerged from the decline of the Silk Road was a different one. The knowledge of a round world, connected by land, was replaced by a world connected by sea. The maps changed. The centre of the world, from a Eurasian perspective, shifted from the heart of the continent to its coasts. But the idea that had been born on the Silk Road, the idea of a truly global world, where one culture's product becomes another's necessity, where one land's faith can find a home in a distant heart, that idea never died. It was the road's final, and most important, gift. It proved that isolation is an illusion, that cultures are not sealed vessels, but permeable membranes, constantly influencing and being influenced by one another. The caravan is gone. The camels that walk the deserts today are few, and their bells sound only for local, small journeys. The great caravanserais are empty, their wells dry. But the path they walked, the invisible line of cultural force that they established, remains. It remains in the DNA of our languages, in the ingredients of our food, in the patterns of our art, and in the deep, often unacknowledged, understanding that no civilization, no matter how great, has ever truly flourished alone. The Silk Road ended, but in its ending, it created the blueprint for the modern world. A world forever connected, for better and for worse, by the invisible, enduring threads spun from the silk of that first, brave, and endless caravan. Its journey is over, but its story is now our story, and its echo is the sound of our own interconnected world, a hum that has never truly faded. Its journey is over, but its story is now our story, and its echo is the sound of our own interconnected world, a hum that has never truly faded. And so, we find ourselves here, at the end of our own long, quiet journey together. We have walked from the seeds of desire in distant courts, across the brutal, beautiful geography that tested the human spirit, to the zenith of the Golden Age, where the caravan became a world unto itself under a canopy of endless stars. We witnessed the great shift, the slow, sombre decline, as the world turned its gaze to the sea, and we have listened for the echoes that remain, in our words, our food, and our very blood. The Silk Road was never a single road, you see. It was an idea that the vast, empty spaces on the map were not barriers, but bridges. That the silence between empires was not an absence, but a potential for conversation. It was a testament to the quiet, stubborn power of the mundane over the monumental, for it was not the edicts of emperors that built this world, but the accumulated footsteps of countless, nameless travellers. The caravan master reading the stars, the merchant haggling in a dozen tongues, the monk patiently translating a sutra by candlelight, the guard shivering through a desert night. Their collective endurance wove the tapestry. We began this journey as a story for sleep, a narrative to quiet the mind by inviting it to wander through vast, silent spaces. And I hope it has been so. I hope the rhythm of the endless caravan, the soft, steady plod of the camels, the whisper of the wind over the dunes, the deep, resonant silence of the cave temples, has brought a measure of peace to your own thoughts, a spaciousness to your own mind. The past, when viewed not as a series of loud battles, but as a slow, patient unfolding, can be a profound comfort. It reminds us that our own hurried lives are but a single, brief moment in the long, patient caravan of time. The great cities of the route, Samarkand, Bukhara, Dunhuang, Kashgar, are no longer the cosmopolitan crossroads they once were. Yet, if you walk their old streets today, you can still feel it. A certain quality in the light, as if it shines through the ghost of a forgotten market. A faint, lingering energy in the dust, the memory of 1,000 comings and goings. The past is not dead there. It is simply sleeping, its dreams filled with the scent of spices and the sound of camel bells. It waits, not for a rediscovery, but for a quiet acknowledgement. A nod from a passing traveller who understands that they are walking on a road paved not with stone, but with stories. And what of us, the quiet community of listeners gathered here in the dark? We are the latest wayfarers on this old path. We have not carried silks or spices, but we have carried our attention. We have been willing to listen to the whispers of the wind, to learn the language of the dust. In doing so, we have kept the most vital part of the Silk Road alive, its capacity to connect, to inspire wonder, and to remind us of our shared, fragile humanity. This connection, forged in the quiet of the night, is the true legacy of the endless caravan. And so, as our caravan too must finally come to rest, I leave you with this simple, somber truth, that endings are but a different kind of horizon. The sun has long set on the Silk Road, but the starlight that guided its travellers remains. That same starlight now shines through your window. Let it be a reminder of the vast, beautiful, and interconnected world you're a part of. A world built by dreamers, merchants, and wanderers who dared to trace a line of hope across the emptiness. Thank you for walking this long road with me. Thank you for your quiet company. I am the Somber Historian, and this has been a journey on the ancient Silk Road. May the echoes of the caravan linger in your dreams, and may you always find peace in the deep, patient silence of the past. Good night.